Raj. Thank you as well, by the way, to the Rasool family here at Farham, one of the great South Asian restaurants in Alberta. Give them a big hand for welcoming us here. And Romee, where are you, Romee? Thank you. There you are. Okay. Thank you so much for your leadership, your friendship, and your commitments to Alberta. Truly appreciate that. And all of the other special guests and dignitaries, just all of you for your presence and the support for Alberta that it demonstrates. Friends, many of you were involved in our effort over 3 years to build a united alternative to the socialist NDP, to create a big tent, free enterprise coalition that could get our province back on track. Because between 2015 and 2000 and our election, we went through 4 or 5 years of economic decline and stagnation, and many people were feeling the pain of that, on top of a federal government in Ottawa that was often very hostile to our largest industries. And people were desperate to find a way forward. But unfortunately, the conservative movement in this province, the free enterprisers, had gotten so focused on what the small differences between them, that they split themselves into and created the perfect conditions to elect an NDP government. Now, I have no doubt that the folks in the NDP are well-intentioned, and I respect their public service. But I also have no doubt that their basic values are not those of the vast majority of Albertans. They believe in the politics of resentment. They believe that when people work hard in the private sector, they invest their livelihoods and their life savings in a business, and they get ahead and they succeed. Socialists look at that as a failure. They look at that with resentment. They want to discourage hard work and success and enterprise. That's why they raise taxes on businesses and on individuals. They believe that governments and bureaucrats know better how to spend an extra dollar than families or small business people and entrepreneurs. That's one of the fundamental differences. They also believe that bureaucrats and politicians know better how to educate people's kids than do their parents. And we believe as conservatives that parents should be in charge of the education of their children. They believe that government is the answer to every problem. We as conservatives are practical and pragmatic. We believe that, yes, sometimes government is necessary to address market failures and to help address deep social problems. But we also believe, as Rajan just said, in the creative power of free action by people coming together through civil society, through faith-based organizations, charities and nonprofits, and yes, businesses themselves, to prevent and solve social problems. That's what we believe. That's what has built the Alberta advantage. That is why Alberta became the envy of the world, in so many ways the most prosperous province in the country, but not in those years of the NDP government. So we put together this movement. It was heavy. It was a lot of hard work. And I want to acknowledge and thank all of you who participated in that. We ran on an election platform in 2019, not to just kind of tinker at the edges or just to defeat the NDP on a negative campaign. Not at all. We decided to make the bold, politically risky decision to run on a detailed, robust plan for deep reform to get our province back on track. 372 specific ideas that we put out in our plan for a strong Alberta. Now, that was not the smart thing to do politically, because every time you put out a new policy, you invite criticism and opposition. But it's something we thought was necessary. The province needed strong, bold leadership to get our province and its economy back on track. We were elected with that, and with the largest democratic mandate in Alberta history. Now, there's a lot of pundits out there criticizing me or our government for one thing or another. I will remind you, all of the same pundits, the columnists, the people on Twitter, all of those folks, they said that none of this was going to be possible. There's no way that we could reunite conservatives. And then, we were unpopular. We weren't going to win that election. At the very end, at the last week of the 2019 election, they were writing columns, these so-called experts, saying that the NDP was coming on strong and it was going to be a close finish and the NDP might win. We defeated them by 26 percentage points, ladies and gentlemen, in a historic. I don't say that sort of to pat ourselves on the back, although we should every now and then. I say that because so often the critics are frankly wrong, because they don't understand the problems, as we conservatives do. The driving impulse of free enterprise, the work ethic. I mean, look at this room. So many new Canadians who chose Alberta, leaving behind their families and often very good livings in their countries of origin, to take a bold risk on a new country, a cold new country, learning a new language, adapting to a new culture, with no safety net often, with no strings attached, with having to just hit the ground running, often with very little except a strong work ethic. And George is an example of that. And you know, I can't think of anything that is more Alberta than the natural entrepreneurship of immigrants. That's our greatest asset. It's not our oil or our gas, it is our entrepreneurial instinct. One of the reasons I pleaded with Rajan to run for us in 2019 and Rajan, because they are both entrepreneurs. They both created things. They didn't sit there. You know, newcomers don't come to this country with their hand out expecting their neighbors to take care of them. They come here with a work ethic and a willingness to take risks. The very decision to immigrate is a risk-taking entrepreneurial decision. We know that about the culture of this province. So we were elected with that huge mandate, 1 million votes. We hit the ground running. Bill number 1, the Carbon Tax Repeal Act. We brought in the turn off the tax legislation. I often forget this. That got BC to basically surrender on their campaign to stop the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. We brought in the Open for Business Act. We brought balance back to Alberta labor legislation. You're welcome to those of you in the construction industry. That's a big deal. We brought in the red tape reduction plan, through which we have now reduced the number of government rules imposed on Alberta's economy by nearly 25%. 130,000 rules that have been scrapped. We challenged Justin Trudeau's carbon tax in court, challenged his No More Pipelines law in court, and brought in the Choice in Education Act, recognizing for the first time in Canadian law that there is a human right for parents to decide how best to educate their children. We did so much more. We got the ball rolling, and then 10 months in, not even a year in, we were sideswiped by 3. Have you ever heard that phrase, a black swan event? The expression comes because, you know, I guess there used to be an old superstition that if you saw a black swan, it was going to be a very bad luck time, and it was a very rare bird. Well, we got 3 of them at once. 3 once-in-a-century crises. The largest pandemic in a century, the largest collapse in the world economy since the 30s, and the largest collapse of energy prices ever on record. We've already forgot about how bad that was, but we went from $70 oil to minus $40 in the space of 6 weeks. Sounds like somebody remembers. You know, our brilliant finance minister, 𝗃𝗏𝗃𝗏, came into my office in mid-April of 2020 and said, Premier, we have not been able to sell a bond for several weeks, and we are now on track to default by mid-June. We had to begin our contingency planning for emergency cash management as a wealthy province. That's how bad it was. 25% unemployment. We didn't know if it was going to go on for 5 or 10 years like it did in the Depression. We did not know. And no one gave us a textbook, by the way, about how to deal with a once-in-a-century pandemic. None of us had any background or experience in things like that. And so we were thrown into the crucible of 3 once-in-a-century crises at the same time, after being elected with a hugely ambitious reform agenda and inheriting an $8 billion deficit, which meant we had to make some unpopular decisions to reduce spending. And we also inherited the most hostile Prime Minister for Alberta's interests, perhaps, in our country's history, all at once. Now I'm going to take, for some of you who remember Alberta politics, dial the clock back to 2005. Ralph Klein, one of my favorite guys. Ralph was basically, after winning 4 huge majority governments, eliminating the deficit, eliminating the debt, bringing in the Alberta Advantage, hugely popular, went to a leadership review vote and was basically thrown into the ditch by the party members because they thought it was time for a change. Fair enough. Then a new leader was elected, and then but then there was immediate division around that new leader, and undermining of that leader, and eventually Mr. Stelmach was left office prematurely, and then another leader, and there was division, that leader left, and then all of that created 2 parties, and all of that ultimately led to the late Jim Prentice's defeat and the election of the NDP. 10 years, 2005 to 2015, of constant division and turmoil in the conservative movement during good times. What were those governments doing? Anything dramatic? Were they risking or spending political capital? No. Were they cutting spending to balance the budget? No, they had huge surpluses. They were spending more and more. Were they challenged by a global recession or pandemic? No. They had enormous prosperity. Did they have a hostile government in Ottawa? No, they had the friendliest government in Ottawa Alberta's ever had under Prime Minister Harper. So 10 years of good and stable, prosperous times of surplus, high commodity prices, and only tailwinds, no headwinds. And yet, this movement tore itself apart. Is it any wonder that after all that we have gone into, the multiple crises we've had to manage, that we're also dealing once again with problems of internal division? I don't think it's surprising whatsoever, especially because COVID was like a buzzsaw for our coalition. You know, I'm going to speak very frankly to you, and some of you heard me say this, but you all know this. COVID has been incredibly divisive. Every one of in our families, we have had arguments about COVID policy, restrictions and vaccines, in our faith communities, in our businesses, in our local communities. There's been, sadly, a lot of division and polarization in Alberta, especially. Over here, we've got a whole bunch of folks who said that our government was far too reluctant to bring in public health restrictions and way too eager to lift them. And over here, a big chunk of people saying we were far too eager to bring in public health restrictions and we shouldn't have really had any. Instead, what we did was not follow some kind of we didn't calibrate our policy based on slogans or ideology, but based on the facts, on the data, making impossibly difficult choices to seek a balanced approach, which on the one hand would avoid large-scale deaths and prevent a disaster in our hospitals, on the other hand, would minimize the damaging effect on people's mental and emotional and financial well-being through restrictions. Now, other places made other choices. Australia, New Zealand, Quebec, many European countries and others chose sustained hard lockdowns for most of 2 years, schools shut, businesses shut, stay-at-home orders, curfews, police on every street corner. And I can't even think about the damage done to democracy, rights and freedoms, mental and emotional well-being, not to mention financial well-being, incalculable. On the other hand, people say, Jason, you should have been like that guy in Florida, DeSantis. First of all, in Florida, they have 3 times more ICU beds per capita. Americans spend a lot more on healthcare. Secondly, they have ended COVID with a COVID fatality rate 3 times higher than Alberta's. People say, I sometimes go into rural Alberta, why couldn't you be like that Governor Noem in South Dakota? Let her rip. Just stand up and do my best Mel Gibson imitation from Braveheart on shouting freedom. Boy, you know, that kind of, at one level, that appeals to my inner conservative. On the other level, she has to account for the fact that South Dakota has a COVID death rate 5 times ours. Is there anyone in this room, or in this party, or this province, who thinks that we would have tolerated 20,000 COVID fatalities, or 18,000 COVID fatalities? I don't. I would never be able to live with myself. Was our response perfect? Absolutely not. Did we make mistakes? Absolutely we did. Will we be able to reflect on those in the future? Of course we will. And one of the key takeaways is to increase healthcare capacity, as we are doing.